Hello and welcome to another episode of Ask the Wizard After Dark. I'm your host, Russ Leteau, aka The Wizard. Hello, a good late night evening for July the 13th. This is another episode of Ask the Wizard After Dark. I'm your host, Russ Leteau, aka The Wizard. I'm starting a mini-series, I'm calling it, and this actually, I talked about it and taught about it this morning on the Ask the Wizard Almost Daily. And remember, you can always check all our Convergence Media HC programming is done through my personal profile on Facebook. So if you go to facebook.com/Russ, R-U-S-S .Leteau, Littau, you'll be able to check it out. So our Facebook Live video teaching goes 11 a.m. Mountain Standard Time every weekday. And of course, this radio show, 11:30 p.m., again, Mountain Standard Time. Everything we do broadcast live, but of course it's also recorded, so you can always check out the recordings later. If you go on Facebook and just search for the hashtag Convergence Media HC, the HC stands for Healing Center, you'll bring up all our broadcasts. When you listen to this, at least initially on Facebook, you're going to click on a link and then it will actually take you to a web page within our broadcasting platform. Now, if you're listening to this live, when you do that, you will find a little area where you can enter text. So essentially, you can type in a comment or a question and I will see it come up on my panel at this end, and I would be more than willing to share any of my thoughts, to just offer my perspective on things, or just to check in and say hi, because the reason that I do all these things, these broadcasts, the online courses, the online group sessions that we do, is to create a network and a community where we can all learn and grow and share together. It's not just one-way communication, right? It's not just me continually in this a never-ending monologue. It's a conversation because we're all in this together, right? And it's important that we work together as a community. So on the broadcast this morning, and it's a mini-series too, and I'm thinking that it will probably end up being almost a standalone, probably online course, for a couple of reasons. One of them is this experience that we all walk through is such an important component of our spiritual and personal growth. And I find that it is one that is often misunderstood, and therefore we don't value it as I believe we should. And maybe more importantly, because we don't understand it, we have some very ineffective tools of navigating our way through it. And for me, as we'll talk about, it's a process, not a place. You see, so the difference is, well, a place is static. A process isn't. A process has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's a vehicle. It's not the destination. And so often, because we don't understand that, and again, we don't understand the landscape of this experience, and we don't have tools to navigate our way through it, so many times, at the very least, we delay this whole process, and all too often we get stuck right in the middle of it. And believe me, this is a very valuable process. It is a proverbial blessing in disguise, but it's not one that you want to live in. It really is a process that you move through. And that process is the dark night of the soul. Not Batman, not the Dark Knight. It's the dark night of the soul. And when I first started down this path, so it's actually coming up really close now to, 13 years. So really 13 years ago, today, this month, I had just stepped through the looking glass. As I like to say, my lower back injury had been healed by somebody who'd read a book on energy healing. That was my first experience on the other side of the looking glass. And of course, when my back was healed up, that's when I stepped through and I began to explore this whole new world that had been around me all the time. I just never knew it was there. And so very early on, I discovered this thing called the dark night of the soul. And as I read about it and explored it, there was one thing that very early on I was quite sure about, and that was that I didn't want it. Because it didn't sound fun at all. And it was the last thing that I wanted to experience. And I think this is where some of the misunderstanding and confusion comes in, because often it's described this way. Just think of the name, the dark night of the soul. Like, just the name is oppressive when you think about it, right? And there's a lot of power in labels, right? When we label an experience, we're attaching to it a whole set of parameters and circumstances, right? And if you think about that, just that label, I was joking today on the broadcast, it's kind of right up there with, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, right? And for me, the first thing is to clarify the understanding of what it is. And while it often isn't pleasant, it's often difficult. It's not in and of itself a bad, quote unquote, thing. And it is a vital part of our growth. And so, while we don't have to like it, I think it's important to understand it and value it. And so for me, I don't call it the dark night of the soul. I call it, and to me this is the more accurate term, I call it the emergence process. Because this leg of our journey, this valley that we'll walk through more than once as we grow, well, it's often difficult and challenging. It really is the process of emerging into a greater expression of who we are. So again, back in the summer of 2004, right about this time, maybe a few weeks from now, I had joined a small meditation group in my hometown of Red Deer, Alberta. And I was actually waiting in a little coffee shop along the side of a highway because I was having coffee with my meditation leader at the time. And you see, when I first woke up, I discovered this conversation that the universe, through source wisdom, is having with us all the time. Right? So the universe is always talking to us. It's just that we're not aware that it is. We don't understand how to nurture that relationship and even identify its voice. And I have to confess, probably by good luck more than wisdom, I identified this voice and I began to write down different concepts that I believed the universe was telling me. And I can remember I was sitting in this little coffee shop on the side of a highway, think of it as an interstate, I suppose, and I wrote down in my little journal, using my words to describe the information I was receiving, and it was, there will be times when you go through a quote-unquote birthing process, when a piece or pieces of you essentially die or fall away so that a greater expression of you can be birthed. And so for me in this first episode of this mini-series, I don't know how many there will be. I guess we'll count them when we're done. In this first episode, I want to frame the topic matter that we're going to be talking about. And so I'm not going to call it Dark Night of the Soul anymore. I'm going to call it the emerging or emergence process. It is, think of it as a valley that we walk through, not a destination we walk to. And that's a really important thing to remember, that this is it's a natural aspect of growth. And the more we understand it, and the more tools we have to navigate through it, the more efficiently, and then therefore the quicker, we can get the job done. Now, what I can tell you is that it's almost always uncomfortable, challenging, sometimes difficult, sometimes painful. But here's the thing. When did we as a society decide those things were bad and to be avoided at all costs? Right? I'm not saying that they're good either. But where did we decide that pain and difficulty was bad? You see, sometimes in our growth, we will walk through those valley experiences where it is challenging and difficult and, yes, maybe even painful. But when you think about it, we do that in our day-to-day lives anyway. How many times have we said, oh man, I'm really not looking forward to this, whatever it is, but I know I need to get it done and I just need to basically suck it up and do it. And at the end, maybe there was pain. You're cleaning out the garage, right? And the garage hasn't been cleaned for 10 years and it's full of all sorts of stuff. And you go, this is the weekend. I've got to clean out the garage. And I know it's not going to be fun. And there's going to be a lot of sweat and a lot of lifting and toting and stuff. But I know the garage is going to look so great when it's done. And then when you're done, your muscles are sore. Maybe you've got a few cuts and scrapes when you were moving stuff, right? It was maybe even painful and difficult and challenging. But then you look at the garage and it's all nice and clean and you go, yeah, it was worth it. You see, that's what the emerging or emergence process is. It's a very valuable leg of our journey where we're preparing and being prepared for the next expression of who we are. And you see, here's what's important to remember is so many times, and we'll talk about this in one of the episodes, so many times the reason that we're walking through it is because that's the pathway to the manifestations of our next greatest desires. You see, but we have been taught as a society that you and especially in the positive thinking, or if you want to call it quote-unquote new age genre, that you choose your desire, you choose your destination, you choose your goal, and then you just la-di-da-da-da through it, right? And that if you're experiencing things that are difficult and uncomfortable, you must be doing something wrong. Well, it's been my experience, and not just my experience, but I read a lot and I study a lot. And when I look at, I'll say quote-unquote true growth, it requires us to walk through this experience. But just because it's challenging and difficult doesn't mean it's bad. And so often it's that refining process that's happening to prepare the way for the manifestations of our desires. But we look at it and we go, well, that can't be right because that doesn't look very much fun. But you see, that, at least for me, is the bill of goods that we've been sold, that growth and expressions of ourselves, that process is always going to be fun. It's always going to be easy. Well, it's not. Not if you're looking for deep fundamental change. It's not. And don't just take my word for it. When you read, you'll read just document after document from authors and teachers and mystics and things like that, right? So for me, what's important to understand, and I'll wrap up this episode, is that yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it'll be challenging, but it's not bad. And as a matter of fact, it so often is the quintessential blessing in disguise. What's important is to understand that it's a very real experience, and then an understanding of the landscape and some tools to navigate through it are so critical to move through this experience as efficiently and then as quickly as possible to get to the glory on the other side. And that's what we will talk about in the upcoming episodes. We'll also talk about it through a series that will be doing on Facebook Live, and then, of course, following that up with here. So I invite you to walk with me as we step into a really fascinating study on the dark night of the soul, or as I now call it, the emergence process. This is another episode of Ask the Wizard After Dark. I'm your host, Russ Leteau, aka The Wizard.